Hello and welcome. Hello, I'm Suchitra Hammond and I'm the Senior Strategy Manager here at Redco. I'm very pleased to see some of you, but I think some of you are all going to disappear off the screen shortly because of bandwidth and you'll all be muted. But I don't want you to be silent. I want you to use the opportunity today to ask questions, make observations. And so there is a QR code that you can use for Slido if that's your preferred method, or you can use the Teams questions function. They'll be collated and there'll be an opportunity to come back to those. But please do use that function. We really do want to hear from you today. There's a few more people just joining us now. Just give them a minute to use the QR code if that's the thing you want to use. So, okay. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. We have a packed agenda today. I'm going to move to introductions shortly, but just wanted to point out that we've got quite a lot of speakers for you today, but there will be a question and answer session at the end and a little bit of a wrap up. So got a lot to get through, and I'm going to actually use the next slide, which introduces our speakers, to explain a little bit about them. And first off, we're going to have a few words from Colin Mullaney, who is the Senior Policy Manager at Ofgem in the Consumer Vulnerability and Debt team, and we're very pleased to have him on board to give a little bit of a perspective from Ofgem in terms of the PSR. He'll hand over to Steve Crabb, who has many hats to wear, but today is here in the capacity of the work that he's been doing with ENA and Water UK. So the inroads that have already been made there and the work that they're doing going forward with DNOs and water companies and the data sharing that's already happening there. He'll hand over to Gabriella Story from Morehouse Consulting, and she's going to talk to you about a piece of work that actually stemmed from a paper that we wrote earlier this year on how we could, under the REC umbrella, look at the work of look at our work and look at what we could be doing in terms of helping with the PSR, and particularly looking at it from a consumer focus, looking at the outcomes and an outcomes-based approach. So she's going to talk to you a bit about that concept and the work that they did in kind of challenging and looking at that concept more fully. She will then hand over to Andy Mower, our colleague here at Redco. He's the in the strategy team with us, and he also published a paper earlier this year and will be talking to us about how we could do more to help those consumers who need support with medical equipment use, so the dependency they have on that and what we could be doing in that space. He then hands over to Helen Sharp-Patterson from Northumbrian Water, and she's been leading on a project called Support for All. A lot of you may be familiar with that, and she'll be able to give you a bit of a background on that and talk to you about the progress of that project. And last but not least, there'll be Louise Singleton, who's here from GemServe, and she'll be talking to us about consumer protection in the world of heat networks. So a lot of things to canter through, but it's not going to be not interactive. There'll be an opportunity for you to put questions to the panel. Please do add them, as I say, into the chat functions, and we'll be collating those in the background. So before I kind of hand over formally to our speakers to share their thoughts and their knowledge and their experience in this space, I wanted to pause and reflect on why we're all here today. And I know for all of us, PSR is part of our lives, part of the things that we work with, and it's a very different place from where the PSR started off in life and what it was required to do and where it's going. And some of you might say, well, we're already collaborating. Indeed we are. We're sharing information. Indeed we are. But are we sharing the same vision, the same knowledge, and the same, are we all pulling in the same direction? The reason why I say that is because the PSR was really designed to do something different, and it is really being evolved into delivering things that weren't originally envisaged. So how are we making sure that we are being more collaborative and understanding what that vision is. And a lot of us will say, we know what that is. That's to get to a tell me once principle. That's the holy grail. But there's a lot to do to get from where it started to where we want it to be. So how do we make sure that we are sharing that knowledge? And today is an opportunity to not only hear about all the things that are currently already in train, but all the things that are coming up in the pipeline, things like consumer protection in the heat networks, for example. Those are future things that we need to be thinking about now. And how are we joining the dots with that? How are we thinking about implementing some of these things? Is there something, if we did X and Y over here, that would help 2 or 3 things be implemented further down the road? Could we be more savvy? Could we think more smartly about how we're doing this? And so this concept of kind of bringing us together to share our knowledge and be more collaborative about our vision and joining the dots is something we want to test with you today, and understand whether that has legs and whether we could be doing something in that space to pull together the many strands of the work that is going on and will be going on to reach to help us reach that holy grail of the tell me once principle. So I think that's probably enough from me, and given that we've got a lot to get through, I'm going to hand over to Colin.
Hi there, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Or can one person hear me? We've got.
We can all hear you.
Yeah, we can.
Wonderful, good. We wake up call there. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to see some familiar faces here, as well as some new ones. As Suketra said, I'm Colin, and I work in Ofgem's consumer vulnerability and debt team. And our team basically looks after the licence conditions and the guidance and other policy which fulfills Ofgem's statutory duties to protect consumers in vulnerable situations. And why am I here? Well, I'm leading on our work to support and drive forward vulnerability data sharing, which was launched off the back of our Vulnerability Summit this April of this year, which some of you may have attended, looking in particular at priority services registers. What's Ofgem's role in this? Well, mostly it involves supporting industry action along with other regulators and government, removing blockers, setting ambition where we can. We're guided by our mission to improve outcomes for consumers in vulnerable circumstances. And while we are a regulator, which means we typically solve problems by making rules in the classic sense, I think our primary role in this at present is to influence and to convene, especially given the cross-sector nature of the solution. Now, I'll say a little bit about what our chief executive has kind of set out as our role in this. So our CEO, Jonathan Brearley, said that a foundation stone of supporting vulnerable consumers and understanding the needs of those customers is understanding the needs of those customers so that support can be targeted and then subsequently provided. And one way that we require suppliers and network companies, as you'll know, to do that right now is by holding and maintaining a priority services register. But Mr. Brearley's been publicly very clear that across utilities and beyond, we need to go further and we need to go faster in integrating and improving the data collected across firms in different sectors where that's in the interests of consumers. And he's been explicit that we should all consider building towards a joint register, not just between water and energy, but including wider sectors and potentially local and national government, such as the data held by the Department for Work and Pensions. And that this should be based around the principle, as Suketra said, of tell us once, a single point of disclosure to a single agency or organisation, after which the information required to anticipate, identify and respond to the household's needs is shared across different organisations. So to break that down, there's 2 things there. One, start breaking barriers now and do what we can to build on existing data sharing projects and incrementally progress on a monthly or a quarterly basis, that real short-term action. And then secondly, draw those boundaries and answer those questions to shape what a more universal or national register looks like, which might take years to implement. So there's those 2, that twin track approach in the short term. versus the longer term. And our job, as I see it, is to work across government, regulators, industry and the third sector on those two aims. And the working group that Ofgem set up after our vulnerability summit in April, which I chair, attended by Ofwat and different parts of government as well, is committed to pushing that short and longer term ambition. And we formed a working definition of a universal PSR to start to answer some of the key questions. And we're keen for input from everyone on that. And I'm happy to, to pick up conversations after this with anyone who's interested in that. And we're in active discussion with bits of government to see who can drive that work forward. And as well as that, we applaud the tremendous work that Water UK and the Energy Networks Association and now Energy UK are doing to connect up PSRs across water, energy networks and suppliers. And I believe Steve Crabb's going to speak more about that shortly or even right after me. So, and we also commend the other projects in train like Support for All, led by Northumbrian Water, and the work by the Energy Market Bodies Forum looking at innovative uses of data to support consumers this winter. But there is further to go in the short to medium term, both to improve those processes and to widen sharing of data still further, to not only ask the question, can we get as many households as possible on priority services registers, but also ask the question, can we improve the priority services register in terms of how it works, who can access it, and the outcomes it delivers for consumers. And that's where I think the Retail Energy Code Company, our hosts for this afternoon, have been doing a lot of thinking that is to be commended, perhaps trying to provide a bridge or a middle stage from where we are now to where we can go, which is towards a more universal or tell us once system. We might not reach that promised land of a sort of universal national register, which is all singing and all dancing. So it's all the more important to pursue those improvements that are in the gift of industry today. And that's, I guess, what we're here this afternoon to talk about. Essentially, we're all trying to do our bit to protect people at risk of harm and serve people's essential needs. So in short, my message is let's get on the same page. Let's start putting dates on things and making them happen. I think that's probably my time, so I'll leave it there. Thanks to RECCO for inviting us along, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the great work that's going on in this space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. I don't know if there's any burning questions for you now or whether we can skip on and come to you at the end. So thank you very much, Colin. That's really useful. And as you say, the Holy Grail is there, but what can we be doing in the meantime is I think a really important message. So thank you. Thank you. Marvellous. So we can move straight on to Steve Crabb. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Skeetra. Great to be with you here today and great to see
There's a lovely stream of sunshine. You look like you're bathed in sunshine there.
It's quite amazing, isn't it? Hold on, I'll just close the curtain.
It was quite stunning.
That's better. That
there we
literally just happened. Apologies. Yeah, so as you said earlier, and as Colin intimated, I'm here today to talk about work that has been going on for some time to get the existing PSR data held by water companies and energy companies being shared across the two industries. So it's very much addressing the current elephant in the room, the here and now. That's not to say that the wider issues raised by Jonathan Brearley and by RECCO, aren't important, but what this particular project is about dealing with things, facts as they exist on the ground, and making them work as best we can for the benefit of existing customers. So my role is working on behalf of Water UK with Energy Networks Association, and working very closely now with Energy UK as well as the regulators Ofgem and Ofwat to try to get data sharing going. It's a piece of work that's been ongoing since 2017, which is when conversations first began around the desirability of getting water company data exchanged with energy PSRs. There have been various milestones along the road, which I'll talk about in a second. But for sort of to baseline this, the social obligations report back in 2016, which is the last data that I've seen, said that around 13% of UK households were on energy PSRs aggregated against across both gas and electricity. I know from talking to two of the former Big Six legacy energy suppliers that actually they've got around about 33% of their entire customer base on their PSR. So I would not be surprised if since 2016 that 13% has gone up significantly with market consolidation. But for comparison, at the beginning of the current price review period in 2019, the average water company PSR had less than 2% of customers on it. And by the end of this current price review period in 2024-25, the average will be about 9%. Today, it's around about 7.5%. So there's clearly a lot of data sitting on the priority services registers of energy suppliers and through their data exchange practices of the DNOs, the electricity networks in particular, that water companies could benefit from when it comes to safeguarding customers and identifying those most at risk. But equally, we know from sampling that the kind of conversations that water companies have with their customers are qualitatively different from the kind of conversations that they have that energy suppliers are having with their customers. And so there are customers on water company PSRs who are not currently on energy supplier PSRs, because it may be that a customer has revealed the need for dialysis, for clean water supply, for other forms of medical treatment, and but they wouldn't have thought to mention that to their energy company. So these are some of the many reasons why sharing data between energy and water is really, really important, and that's recognised by both industries. But it has taken a while to get where we are today. As I say, that process goes back to at least 2017. One of the first milestones was in 2019, when the two industries agreed to harmonise their needs codes. Largely speaking, the water companies adopted the existing needs codes operated by energy companies, but not entirely. So a couple of additional needs codes were added in to ensure that that water-related vulnerability could be included in there as well, so that the needs codes work for both industries. That was in 2019. In 2021, thanks to intervention from Ofgem and Ofwat, we got very helpful guidance from the Information Commissioner's Office, which made it clear that the most practical legal basis for capturing customer data in the world of cross-industry data sharing would be legitimate interest, and the most appropriate basis for sharing that data would be substantial public interest. And that was in August, I think, of 2021. And in December, the ICO kindly confirmed that advice applies to suppliers as well. So I think we're very clear about the legal basis, and that really helped to open the doors to data sharing. And I think we'd probably have made progress a lot sooner than we have done if COVID hadn't hit. So that very much sort of slowed progress down, but with very firm but gentle encouragement from our regulators. And at this point, I have to say thank you, Colin, for the kind words that you said. I'd say the same thing back to you. I think both regulators have been really fantastically helpful in terms of moving this work to get data sharing going, and very much by adopting an approach of moving obstacles out of the way, as opposed to putting in place additional regulatory drivers, which have, at this point anyway, have not been needed. So in 2023, March 2023, data sharing began between the whole of the water industry and energy networks. I say the whole of because some water companies and some DNOs were already sharing PSR data prior to that point, and had been doing so for some time, and they'd got there under their own steam. But all the rest started data sharing in at the end of March, with one exception, which is a bit too technical to go into here. The data sharing is being done on the basis of bilateral arrangements between every customer in England and Wales is basically served by a DNO and a water company. And we calculated there are 37 unique combinations that you could be served by. So all 37 have got bilateral data sharing arrangements with each other, so that we know that all customers can have their data shared. It's largely a manual process at the moment, which is not sustainable in the long term. We need to address that, and that's why we're now looking at what we're calling phase 2 of the process, and there are 2 main parts to that. So the 2 main parts are, first of all, we want to include energy suppliers in data sharing, because most energy suppliers are still using consent as the legal basis for data capture and data sharing, and they're not asking customer consent for that data to be shared on to water companies. So DNOs are not sending out information on to the water companies at the moment. And that's something that we want to see change, because the water companies need to be receiving that data from suppliers, so that they have visibility of where customers are really at risk. And in some cases, water company data is not being shared on to energy suppliers at this point in time because of concerns around consent and the legal basis. So harmonizing all parties in this 3-way marriage on as substantial public interest is key to us. And so Colin and colleagues from Ofgem have been working with me to meet with suppliers and to try to understand what concerns they may have, how we can help them. And those conversations have been very rich and very productive. We're really confident that we can get the vast majority of the industry onto SPI by 31st of December this year, if not by 31st of March, because we know that in some cases, due to CRM migrations and other absolutely understandable constraints, they won't all make it by the 31st of December, but I think most of them will do. So that's the first part, is creating a supportive environment for energy suppliers to make that change, and then we can have unrestricted data flow both ways. The second part of phase 2 of the project is to try to find an industry-wide automated solution. Won't replace what the suppliers and the networks are currently doing with their 225 data flows. That will still continue unchanged. This is so that water companies and networks can exchange information in the best way possible. So we'll do a proper procurement exercise, scanning all the options. We've got a good sense of the landscape and who's currently out there. We've also been holding conversations with other parties, like Experience Support Hub platform, which is not necessarily a PSR data sharing engine, but is very analogous to it, and is helpful way of understanding customers' service needs. And so we're working with a range of different partners out there, including RECCO. So one of the things that we're sure that RECCO will be able to help with is the question of what happens when customers switch energy supplier. Because at the moment, a lot of that data is lost as a result of the switch. That's a quick win that I'm sure that we can address. I'm with Sukitra in the view that the current PSR needs codes are not perfect. If we were starting again from scratch, we probably wouldn't come up with exactly the same PSR needs codes. But as some of you will have heard me say at Ofgem's Vulnerability Summit earlier this year, I've become a radical pragmatist as a result of this project. We have to work with the reality as it is on the ground today. Let's get data sharing going across the three parts of the utility sector, and then we can have conversations further down the road about changes to the needs codes. But let's be grounded in the here and now, and get that working. I think that's the main thing I wanted to say. I guess it's helpful to just mention that ENA, Energy Networks Association, have put a change request in to REPCO, which we seek to change the use of the current consent flag for those who are familiar with D0225 data flows. That would be an important enabler, I think, if we can get that landed. But so that's where we are. Optimistic about the future. A lot of moving parts, but great collaboration from everyone concerned. So long may that continue.
Thank you, Steve. That's very useful background. Is actually what strikes me is the scale of the project that's been undertaken, and just hearing about the 37 bilateral agreements. That's a challenge and a task in itself, and huge inroads being made there. But absolutely agree with you. What could we be doing not only with that piece of work that's ongoing, but what could we be doing to help support those incremental changes that move things forward? So definitely have a note of those. Some of those we're already aware of, but it's really good to hear, and certainly it's a sense of perspective it brings with it, the size of the task that's involved. Thank you for sharing that. That's been really insightful. We're doing well for time, and I have a question for you. I'm just going to see who it is. Kerry, making a note of other participants involved in the GAT network.
Yeah,
to support customers. Well,
yeah, Kerry's absolutely right. Sorry, that was very remiss of me. Is that that another aspect of phase 2 is that we're talking to the gas networks, the GDNs, who are absolutely critical partners in this, and we're also talking to the IDNOs and the NAVs from the water industry as well, to make sure we get as close as we can to 100%. So thanks, Kerry. Megan, I had a question, I see.
Yeah, it was the same really, just to see what engagement you've had with the Independent Network Association and the IDNOs. So you've just answered it, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve will also be on the panel, so do think of anything that you want to put to him. So thank you for that, Steve. That's been great. I'm going to move us on then to Gabby, who's going to talk to us about some of the work that they've been doing with us here at REPCO. I'll hand over.
Thanks, Keisha. Hi everyone. So yeah, as Keisha said, I'm from Morehouse Consulting, and I think it's important just to give you a bit of an overview of how I kind of came into the PSR, the world of PSR. So REPCO had already started doing some work, obviously, around this space, and prepared some thought leadership, looking at the energy code and thank you, I've just seen you move the slides, and what improvements they could do in this space. And this is where the kind of the tell me once approach and moving towards an outcomes-based approach for consumers and through that kind of consumer lens really came from. They started to explore really how could they do this? Could this be through opening data, looking at the governance framework that was currently in place? And as you can see, there's a whole paper was prepared on this with that link at the bottom there. So the work that I'm going to talk to you about was really commissioned off the back of this. Could it work? Would it really be feasible? And really looking into doing that discovery work behind that to take this forward. So if I could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what did we do? How did we start this piece of work? When I came into the project, there wasn't that real clear view of the end-to-end consumer journey for registering for the PSR. The process, it was felt at the time, was quite siloed. It could be a little bit confusing for some consumers, or that's what was being reported back from kind of consumer advocacy groups on the ground. There were issues around accessibility. So both the content sometimes could be a bit confusing, digital access, not everyone could have access to a computer or to a phone to access an app. And the feeling sometimes could be that it was more of a regulatory obligation rather than really taking it that step further, and looking at how we could best help, and how consumers could benefit from being registered to the PSR. So the approach that we took, we came out and interviewed quite a few people within the space. So I've seen a few familiar faces. So good to see you all again. Just to get that full picture, kind of from suppliers, from DNOs, from charity groups who have that day-to-day contact with consumers, to get that real view of what was going on and what the current process looked like. We also used existing documentation, so the mapping that had been supported by the ENA. We used that as our starting point, and really to this, built on it, mapped and validated the current processes, so we could then start to pinpoint where there were gaps, where there were issues, and therefore where there was scope for opportunities to make this process work better for the consumers. And as you can see from that kind of top right box, that was the scope and the kind of the lenses that we looked at the PSR through, from the perspective of a consumer. If I could have the next slide, please. I won't go into too much detail, but this is just to give you that visual of how the mapping looked. And then we also kind of prepared that step-by-step Excel to sit alongside it. So that was our discovery piece, and how we really started off this piece of work. Thank you. So what did we find? There's quite a lot on this slide, but what we wanted to really pull out was there were quite a few observations that we could group into themes of kind of pain points for consumers. I think the key ones I want to draw your attention to here are around accessibility and awareness. So for consumers, the feedback we kept seeing was that there was issues around digital access. The content wasn't always clear in terms of what they could actually benefit, or what suppliers, what DNOs could do for consumers who were vulnerable and registered, looking to register on the PSR. And there was also that lack of awareness. Communications maybe weren't always proactive. They were sometimes a bit more reactive. And that presentation of information was sometimes inconsistent. So the whole experience could just be quite confusing for consumers. If I could move to the next slide, please. That was what we found. What did we do next? So from that discovery piece, we've started to look at options for next steps, kind of really looking at it through the perspective of these benefits for the consumer, and thinking about what are the key considerations, what questions do we really need to ask, and how could we really start to take these next steps towards improving that journey for them. So the first one, the as is, we've already talked to. That's the current experience. We take that as accepted. The second option is really enhancing what we currently have. So taking those observations, building out kind of remediation steps, and really looking to enhance what's currently there, providing a more satisfactory kind of minimum service as we see it for the consumer. The third option is this outcomes-based approach, in which incrementally, and that's quite key, we're not looking for a big bang approach, because we know that that's not going to work, but really looking to bring this into kind of a more centralised process that's built on this tell me once principle. It's outcomes based, and it which really switches the focus to what does the consumer need rather than what is the consumer's personal circumstances. So to do this, we looked at it all through the lens of a case study. So we took the example of a consumer who had become medically dependent on a dialysis machine that they were looking to run and operate from their home. Next slide, please. Thank you. So again, I won't spend too much time on this, but this is just to really demonstrate the journey or the current as is state, how it looks. So you can see the key features are obviously that it's a siloed experience for the consumer, it's disjointed, it's inefficient, that they have to keep registering multiple times for the various PSRs with the various suppliers. There's a potential that they're missing out on kind of key benefits because they're just not aware of them, was the feedback that we kept hearing from the charity consumer groups, or they're not able to access them, especially in the current climate with the cost of living. People haven't got the access to phones and the internet, and that's only something that's going to is getting worse, really. And it's obviously the responsibility falls on that consumer to keep making updates when they're needed, and to really to stay on top of it when they've got a lot of other things going on. So that's our first option. If I could move to the next slide, please. Improvements to as is. So this is really using all the recommendations we found from the discovery piece. So the consumer, once they've received the diagnosis, they become more aware, or they potentially become more aware of the PSR and the benefits that they could receive, because that communication piece has been improved. The language used around comms is more accessible for some people, and that kind of process has just been improved in terms of being more proactive in advising the consumer of what they could, how they could benefit. They only have to register once, so this is a progression towards that tell me once approach. So obviously looking at the legal basis for data transfer and data sharing, it makes it a more efficient and much quicker process for the consumer. Standardizing the questions that they have to answer across suppliers is something that we found could really improve the experience, and making sure they're able to use their preferred method of contact. So not just offering a website or a sign-up page or an app, making sure people can pick up the phone if that's their preferred way. And then that last piece around not having to register again when they change the supplier, or if we manage to use that legal basis of consent. But with this approach, I think the feeling was that it was kind of a missed opportunity to really explore a more holistic way of doing this in a more holistic system. So this is where we introduced option 3, which is on the next slide, please. Thank you. So really focusing on this outcomes-based approach. We looked at, within option 3, we broke it down again, as you can see from the boxes at the bottom. So we have A and B, which we felt were options we could look to explore now, really. And this is all very much discovery work. So please do keep sending in questions and give us your feedback on this. The third option, option C, we've included it for completeness, but as we've kind of put in that note, we know that there is other work going on in this space, kind of around this centralized hub idea for the PSR. We obviously don't want to duplicate efforts. So for the purpose of this presentation, we won't kind of go into detail on that option, but just wanted to include it for information. So if we dive into that option 3A on the next slide, please. Thank you. So using that same case study of the consumer with that recent diagnosis, what we looked at doing and what our conversations and interviews led us to was We could set up the consumer record on the existing EES system and assign their information to the MPAN number for the property. This would then allow the data user, whoever's making this record, what we're proposing that they would simply tick a box that would add an additional layer of data and would add a flag to the consumer's record, simply indicating that that consumer is a PSR registered consumer. This would then send out a kind of an automated flow, an automated data flow to the water companies, to the DNO, and that would obviously mean that the consumer would not have to keep registering with all of their energy suppliers or when they change supplier. Using the MPAN would also mean that the flag could remain if the consumer changed their supplier. So it kind of takes away that need to keep updating new suppliers. And you can see we've talked to that on the kind of the key features, that it really moves towards an outcomes-based approach, as it allows that the provider really just to see that there is that PSR flag, but it doesn't tell them, it tells them that consumer needs additional support and they need to see those benefits, but it doesn't tell them exactly what the consumer situation is. So it removes that personal data being shared unnecessarily. It'll keep moving the dial on that tell me once approach, and it opens the doors to potentially sharing data further outside of just moving towards sharing it more freely. If we move to the next slide, please. So the second option is a build on adding that flag. So what we'd propose here is the example that we've used. You add that flag and then you add just one extra additional layer of detail in that. For example, it could be a gas safety check is added as well. This then means that the focus remains on identifying that someone within the property needs that extra support. It lets the data user know the need of the consumer, not the details. A further build on this is we had initially said using the MPAN number would be the way to kind of do this quite quickly and to be able to host that level of extra data on the EES. Moving forwards, the discussions have been around using the UPRN, as obviously the MPAN could only be accessed by energy companies, and the aim for this would be to kind of further expand that pool to data users. So we would look to possibly use and ideate using the UPRN or a mechanism like the UPRN to further facilitate this. And allow that participation of further parties such as healthcare trusts or local authorities to be able to access this data and to add this data. So the benefits we see for this would be you could further tailor the experience for the consumer, and really look at what services you could provide and make it a much better experience for them. It makes it more efficient. More parties can access the data rather than having to keep inputting and sharing further data. Further builds on this, it's always going to give us that opportunity to validate what data we have, to cleanse it, and to really sense check that the data that we've got is accurate, whether the correct data fields are being captured, and to just keep that kind of continuous improvement around the data, as I know that's something that keeps coming up as a point to improve on. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Again, just a quick voiceover on this because we're not going to spend too much time, but this is just to show that further option of this centralized hub, where yeah, it's a much further build. We appreciate that, but it's just to kind of include it for completeness. So I won't cover the detail of this slide. You've all got the slides, so hopefully you can have a look at that in your own time if you'd like to. If I can move to the next slide, please. So taking this just a step further, we looked at 3 different ways in which we could feasibly roll out this service and really improve that overall experience for vulnerable consumers. So the 3 options we had for this, the first option around push is it would fall on the NHS or the relevant charity partner to proactively identify vulnerable consumers and to share that data with the energy industry using the kind of key data source of the needs codes. The pull option, so energy suppliers would proactively increase their PSR uptake by identifying those vulnerable consumers and pulling from their existing consumer base. And then charities could also contribute to this and access the PSR service, increasing the PSR access routes and the reach. And that third option, again, similar to previously, we've included it kind of for reference and for completeness, but appreciate it's an unlikely long-term solution, but just wanted to share it for information, really. Have the next slide, please. So this use case, I think, just conscious of time, the key things to pull out here are that it would be someone within the NHS or charity personnel who's involved in kind of supporting a consumer who's recently had that diagnosis with HHD and given the shared PSR service membership. They would take on that responsibility. They'd get them, help them with the PSR registration as part of that setup process. And it's really that the key thing there is that consumer is helped kind of at that first point of identification of vulnerability. If I could have the next slide, please. And this is really just to kind of at a high level look at how that journey could work. So whilst they're kind of coordinating that support for the consumer, they let them know about the PSR, let them know about the benefits they could receive, and kind of then start that process of getting them set up and starting to recognise those benefits. So that's the detail I'm going to go into on this, because I've kind of talked around the scenario of how it could work within the NHS. I appreciate at a high level, but yeah, looking at how consumers can get set up for the electricity cost reimbursement and onto the PSR. And I'm conscious that Andy will be speaking next around kind of the existing data on the PSR and how this could be used for an electricity cost support scheme. So I will pause there and pass that to Sakeecha.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. There's a lot to cover in the space that you had, so appreciate you trying to canter through all of that. But hopefully, if there are questions and things that people want to call out or things they want to understand more, of course, there's an opportunity to speak to you today. But you know, our door is open. We want to speak to people about this, and we want to understand what people are thinking about, and any feedback we can get on this would be super useful for us. So as I say, Gabby will be around at the end to help answer any questions, but so please do raise those. And I appreciate there's a lot of information in that space, and our key thing is, could this work? Do you see this as an option going forward? And we've got a couple of Slido questions coming up around some of this, but I appreciate there's a lot there to give us. And thank you very much, Gabby, for presenting that for us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to move on to invite Andy to speak.
Afternoon. Hopefully you can hear me okay, Sakeecha.
Yes, maybe just need to speak up a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I'm going to give an overview of a project that we undertook earlier this year, focused on what we termed energy intensive vulnerable users. We're really talking specifically about consumers who are running certain types of medical equipment at home and the electricity cost rebates that some of those consumers receive from the NHS. Originally, we looked at this in the context of Ofgem's consideration of moving SOLR costs out of the standing charge and charging for them volumetrically. Part of the reason Ofgem decided not to go through with that change, it said, was its concern about the impact on people running medical equipment at home. So we were interested in understanding a bit more about, in that context, what, if any, electricity cost support those consumers receive, how effective that support is, and how it might be improved. And while we didn't address it in the paper, and we haven't really linked the two yet, I think we'd like to give some further thought in the sort of next phase of the project as to whether the PSR and potential evolution of the PSR is relevant to this issue. If you go on to the next slide, Suchitra. So just to give some context, the NHS currently provides electricity cost rebates to households running two types of medical equipment, dialysis machines and oxygen concentrators. So those are two distinct schemes that operate in slightly different ways. So if you're running an oxygen concentrator at home, there's a bit more consistency on a national basis. Cost support to the patient is administered and delivered by the supplier of the equipment, who installs the concentrator in the household. They take periodic meter readings from the device, and then they rebate the consumer's bank account on the basis of that usage. And obviously then they get the money back from NHS England. Situation with dialysis is more complicated. Individual NHS trusts administer the cost support to patients. They've been instructed by NHS England to come up with their own reimbursement policies, and they've taken different approaches to doing that across the country. So some of them do lump sums, some of them do a calculation of the costs, some of them do reimbursement based on actual bills. So if you're a dialysis user at home, it's a bit of a postcode lottery as to what sort of support you're going to get. It's also a bit of a postcode lottery in terms of whether you're going to get any support at all. In fact, NHS England has had to give a real push over the past couple of years to the trusts, because some of them hadn't implemented reimbursement policies, full stop. So yeah, I mean, in the paper that we published in May, you can see here we went through some of the issues that currently exist with the electricity rebate schemes. At a very high level, often the tariffs or the lump sums that are set for the equipment don't reflect energy prices. They don't meet the actual costs of running the technology, or at least they're slow to be updated when electricity prices change. And also, particularly in the case of oxygen concentrators, often the reimbursement comes to the patient many months after the bill. So the patient is still left very much facing the upfront cost. I won't go into this because the charities are obviously much closer to the patients than we are, have talked about it at length, but obviously these sort of issues result in all kinds of negative implications for the patients. They might ration the usage of that equipment. They might consider choosing to go back into hospital if they can to receive the treatment, with the knock-on effects on NHS costs. Or they might seek to ration other essentials like food or heating. And of course, the question that's more generally asked about these schemes, and that's certainly been raised by a number of charities, is the scope of the coverage. As I mentioned, we've got oxygen concentrator rebates, we've got dialysis rebates, but obviously there's a much wider range of medical technologies that are being used by households. In fact, Contact, which is the charity, said that about 3% of households that are running medical equipment are currently receiving support with the electricity costs. So come to the next slide, Suchitra. So as I say, this has been a major campaigning issue for disability charities in particular over the past year. And in general, they've sort of wrapped it up into their wider advocacy of the need for a social tariff. And there's been various ideas sort of drawn up for how a social tariff could be designed. So there are proposals out there now for unit rate-based discounts. Citizens Advice put forward an idea for some sort of formula-based lump sum that would specifically account for medical equipment users who might be running up very high usage. I think, in our view, and it's certainly reflected in the report that Mary Curie recently put out on this topic, those would be useful, but they're not a substitute for a better functioning support scheme that sought to account for the particular electricity costs associated with running the equipment. It might complement that and offset some of the other additional costs that these households are facing. But I think that for all of the issues that with the NHS rebates, as I mentioned, the principle seems right, that if you're running, say, a dialysis machine at home and taking pressure off NHS resources in the process, then that cost should be reimbursed fully. So what we've put forward in the paper is a proposal, firstly, for delivering a more consistent approach through an independent service that would be responsible for the administration of that cost reimbursement. I think having a service that's sort of dedicated to processing applications from customers, ensuring that payments are aligned with electricity costs. Certainly the feedback from NHS, a lot of the NHS trusts has been that that they struggled somewhat with the administration of these schemes. We also think that by developing a methodology to calculate the cost of running that equipment, that service could credit consumers' electricity accounts to cover their usage, rather than rebating them many months down the line, which, as I say, is currently a source of pain for a lot of consumers in the current arrangements. There are examples of how that could work. So we've been monitoring the trials that Energy Systems Catapult has been undertaking of what it calls the Warm Home Prescription Scheme, where the approach is applied of, as I say, sort of paying that money up front, but it's currently on a much smaller scale. Obviously, it's sort of just been through a pilot phase. But what they've done is they've worked in collaboration with NHS trusts on a project to identify and engage with customers who could be prescribed a warm home. They then have the funds put onto their account with the energy supplier to cover their heating costs and, save the NHS the costs that would otherwise accrue if that individual became ill as a consequence of living in a cold home. And I think it's also worth saying that that whole concept of predefining the level of cost support is also something that is employed in a number of places internationally. So if you look at places like Italy, states in Australia, states in America, a number of them have cost support schemes in place for people running life support equipment at home, and they work on the basis of crediting those customers, through a methodology to calculate the cost of running the equipment. I think that, obviously here at the moment, the elephant in the room with this project somewhat is cost, because we don't have the data from the NHS about, how many oxygen concentrators are being run, how many dialysis machines are being run. Various charities have attempted to get that money, to get that information through Freedom of Information requests, but the NHS Trust have either said they don't have it, or it costs too much for them to get that information. And we don't know at this point the appetite that the NHS has for expanding the support that it can offer through to different technologies. If you go to the next slide, Chitra. So just to bring this back to today's theme, this is a way of thinking about the PSR that I think is to some extent the reverse of what Gabby was talking about, in that whereas Gabby was describing the value of the electricity rebate process to getting more vulnerable consumers onto the PSR, we also want to think about whether we could use that existing data to the advantage of this process. We know that, sort of notwithstanding the problems with those rebate schemes in operation, a very significant proportion of eligible patients are not receiving rebates at all. Kidney Care UK has estimated that upwards of 35% of eligible consumers for dialysis rebates aren't getting any. And so I suppose, as well as the process of signing people up for those rebates, as well as the question of whether that process could be used, we'd also like to sort of look in reverse at whether the data on the PSR could be used to help sort of identify and target consumers who could be receiving this support. Obviously, we know that certain needs codes do identify particular types of medical technology, and so we'd like to explore in a bit more depth whether there's any sort of scope for linking the two. I think that's all I wanted to say, Suchitra. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Again, a huge piece of work and an opportunity there to help people who are otherwise kind of left to their own devices, and depending on which area you happen to fall in, the extent of which you can get some help. I think it's a really important piece of work. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. We're going to have a little bit of a pause from hearing from people, and we're going to go to some Slido questions. Hopefully it's a little bit of a reflection of what we've done so far in the presentations, and some questions that we thought would be useful. Certainly give us some feedback in terms of what your thinking might be. And I'm going to hand over to Jenny to take us through on that.
Hello. So yeah, I've dropped the Slido link in the chat, and if you click through, you should be able to see the first question, which is, which option will help us achieve better outcomes and benefits for consumers? And then you have the option to choose 3A, 3B or other. And Sakitra, if you click that link as well, you should be able to see the responses come through live.
I'll try to find the link and click on it, Jenny.
It's in the chat.
In the chat. Thank you. We have some votes coming through, hopefully. A few more minutes to answer that. Jenny, I can see that people are on there voting, but I can't actually see what the results are. You'll have to tell me how it's going.
So, it looks like so far 3B is the most popular one. So that's got 15 votes. Other has 11, and then 3A has 7.
I also love your comment in the chat there, Colin. If somebody's collected other, please tell us what the great plan is. I love that.
Yeah, I'm all
Great.
ears. I'm all ears.
Are you happy to move on to the next one? I'll
Yeah.
activate that as well. So the question is, do you think PSR has a role to play in identifying and engaging users with a dependency on medical equipment?
Again, I can see numbers clicking over, but I can't see which way they're going. It's like a mystery surprise for me as well.
So largely the answer is yes. So 32 people have voted, 88% say yes, 6% say no, and 6% say they're unsure.
Okay. You do
And
the next
then,
one.
yeah, the last question, which I've just activated, is MPANs are limited to use in the energy industry. Should we be looking to use UPRN instead? So far, the answer is quite a bit more split on this one. The majority say yes, but it's only 59%. 34% are unsure, and 7% say no.
MPAN is used in the electricity industry. You're right, Kerry, and it's a different version of that in the gas industry. So there's actually multiples, and actually using an UPRN might be universal. So it's much better, I think, perhaps, as a move. That's really interesting. Thank you very much for running that, Jenny. That's been really useful. The first one for me, I was, when we started this journey, I was really curious as to why there hadn't already been a flag allocated, and I thought as a minimum step a flag would be the right thing to do. So I'm actually really pleased to see that there is appetite for the flag plus option, as I call it, which is the flag plus some key data items. And I think that opening that up so that there's more visibility means that those people who need help can get the help and the support they need from the parties that can supply that help, and it may not always be the water company or the supplier. And I'm going to come back to some of these questions that are popping, some of the questions and observations coming in, which is really nice to see. And in terms of the using the PSR for medical equipment use, I think that's really, really encouraging, because I think there is a real gap there. People fall through the gap, and there's no consistency in that assistance. I think there's a lot to be done in that space, and I'm very pleased to see that that's largely supported. And I kind of did expect a big divide on the UPRN, because I understand the industry's worked so hard to get us to where we are in terms of our data, and changing that is is another challenge and another thing to do. And given where so many of us are in terms of managing day to day, actually it can be a big challenge that seems daunting. But I think the way to achieve what we want to achieve for the future of the PSR and for the data sharing, there has to be a more universal way of identifying people, and the UPRN seems to certainly be that way forward. So really interesting and really helpful to actually to get your comments on that. So there's a lot coming through on that, and maybe there are things there that we can unpick as we go along in the background and pull those together and use those as observations as part of the discussion that's coming up. And I know that Helen's already going to speak to us shortly about her work, and which does involve the UPRN. So it'll be really helpful to hear how that's progressing and what's being done there. So what's next? In fact, we are going to move to Helen. So I'm going to invite Helen to chat to us now. Hi, Helen. Thank you. That's quite a good segue. That was excellent. You could have planned it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Hi everyone, I'm Helen Patterson. I work at Northumbrian Water, and I'm just here today to share the work that both ourselves and a multitude of partners and stakeholders have worked on. One source of truth has been used, I think, as a terminology, and I guess that's where we initially started when we had the original discussions for this. So I'll give you a little bit of background and then share where we are today with it. If you wouldn't mind moving the slide on. Well, thank you. And just another click there, please, as well. Perfect. So this has been a couple of years in the making so far. As a concept, we wanted to ultimately bring everyone together and determine the best way forward. Sorry, that's my. Is that any better if I hold it very close? Can you hear me all right?
There is a little bit of background noise there, Helen.
1 second.
The joys of being in the office, this is.
I know.
Keep going. We can hear you largely. Keep going, Helen.
Can you hear me all right? Brilliant.
Yeah.
Okie dokie. So yeah, we held a sprint at our innovation festival. Sadly, during the time of COVID, so it was online. But we got to meet variations of sectors in terms of we had water, we had energy, and by energy I mean electricity, gas suppliers. We had NHS, and we had a lot of charitable organisations, SCORE, Page UK, the advice support agencies. We wanted to see what we could do together to help customers in vulnerable circumstances. And as you can imagine, we got very excited, and the sky was the limit at one point, but we eventually managed to narrow that down to focus on one area in particular. And piggybacking on the work that Steve mentioned in 2019 that aligned the PSR needs codes, we wanted to build on the back of the great work that had already been done there. So we decided to focus on the energy and water sharing using the PSR needs codes, and we held a further sprint with multiple water, energy and data companies, different skill sets in each arena. So we had the customer leads and the technical leads looking at the technology requirements. We threw the lawyers and data protection officers into another virtual room to look at the data sharing principles. And then the very clever security experts from the organisations as well, so that we could start off with a base of something that everyone was happy with, a set of requirements to then take forward and build. We were lucky enough then to receive some funding through our Ofwat Breakthrough Innovation Water Challenge, and so launched the pilot Q3 of last year. If you wouldn't mind moving on. So the aim of the pilot, it is the model has drawn itself towards that of a centralized hub, and the idea is to design and create and build and use a platform which is enabled to securely and compliantly hold and share priority services data across 2 regions of England. So our partners and ourselves, we're based in North East England and South East England. You'll see the project partners on there, and I've seen Jill and Joe so far on the invite list. Thank you, huge thank you to you and your teams for all the support so far on this. We wanted to essentially create something in a pilot form, smaller energy, get it working, that we could then share and roll out. So we wanted to come up with a data sharing agreement that would be suitable for all. And again, Steve mentioned the 37 different bilateral agreements that are in place. There are very, very, very many amount of agreements that is allowing that data to be shared, and actually it's doing the same thing, so we want to try and get a consistency approach there. Similar with the matching rules, we're all trying to do the same thing, so let's try and do it one way and do it together. We want to see how many customers that we can find that we are not supporting in our own organisations, and enhance the information that we already had, which we can then share out. Wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. Thank you. So in the last year, we held discussions with the ICO, who were kind enough to give us a real key drive as to how we can successfully and compliantly move us over from consent to the special public interest that Steve mentioned earlier. And this also enables us to not only share the new information that is currently being shared between water and energy, but it also enables us to actually share all the historic data as well. We have, as you would expect, a completed and signed off data privacy impact assessment for the whole overarching project. And in terms of agreements, we've ended up with a data processing agreement with our processor, who is Ordnance Survey for this project, and a data sharing protocol which is aligned between each of us as utilities. And that really sets out, because there is no, we're all doing this based on goodwill, and we're all giving a lot of time and effort to it. Essentially what we are looking longer term is a governor and a gatekeeper for this. But in the absence of that, we've all signed up to agree terms, conditions, how we'll behave, what the data accuracy is going to look like, and that's in our protocol. So our technology progress, so we've got our exact geographical map, and where we will be sharing is where any 2 or more of our partners overlap on a single property. And we are doing it to property level to avoid sharing data that is unnecessary if the customer doesn't take a service to one of the providers. We have a consistent data structure and format agreed. As you would imagine, every single one of us has a different CRM and a different data set. So we needed to work towards an alignment of that. We've agreed the system functionality, the infrastructure and the security, the matching rules, and we've completed the penetration testing and the user testing in the last few months as well. So we have a built system. If we can just move on to the next slide, please. Essentially how it works is the data would be uploaded by each of us as utilities. We have taken a stance of using the UPRN as an option for a universal match where there is one. Where there is not one, this is where our partner, Ordnance Survey, provide a UPRN for a property that does not, where the utility partner does not already have that. So we get that. Where does the support need to go? The data model and the work behind the scenes and the matching rules then tells us what each customer needs at that property. And we can view the data in two different ways. So we requested as one of the requirements for the pilot is, let's see in a certain area that I'm interested in all data. So that would be useful in a scenario where, let's say you need to get a message out to customers. There might be 3 or 4 different telephone numbers that we all have as a joint group of utilities for that customer. Actually, the important thing to us is that we just get that message out there. So we'll use all of them and upload it to the dialer and get the message out there. So that's one view that we can get. The other view is, I guess, closer aligned to this one source of truth, or the latest version that the customer has given any one of us. And this is what we're calling an incident report. And this is where we are saying to the hub, okay, this is my area of interest. Tell me the most up-to-date information of that property and of those customers at that property that you hold. And that's where the rules behind the scenes come in from our team at both Ordnance Survey and Accenture, who have built the platform. If you don't mind moving on, please. Thank you. So just in a visual there, so you'll see the company one might upload their PSR information, and that's represented by the red dots. And then unbeknown to them, there are the blue dot households, which also have PSR needs, and they can draw that information down, discovering some customers that they were previously unaware of that they needed to support. So that's one use case. And then on the next slide, we've got the second use case. If we could just move on there, please. Thank you. So this is where we may have some details, and we may be serving the customer with some additional needs, but we don't have actually all the information that we should do. So you can see company one is missing the telephone number and an additional need code. That's able to be extracted from the hub to get the most up-to-date relevant information for the customer. And obviously this also saves both of us as energy and water suppliers who are proactively trying to engage with our customers to make sure that we've got the most up-to-date information. If without this data sharing, you know, in theory, we could all be trying to contact that customer to get that information and make sure it's up to date in a 2-year period. So it saves the customer needing to get back to us twice, and we can update our records and keep it fresher for longer as well. Next slide, please. Brilliant. So I've just I'll whistle stop through the timeline. So where we are is we have significant amount of data into the hub now, and that is the address data. We've also started loading, we have 2 companies loaded PSR data in there. There'll be a secondary piece where the data without the UPRNs is going up into the hub, and this is where it will use the Ordnance Survey API to remodel the address into the structure required to spit out a UPRN to match it there. We have actually opened the doors literally in the last few days. So the blockers, to sort of speak to this, the door to sharing, have come off, and we are now in a position where we have substantial amount of data in the hub, and each of us are able to draw down data. So we are currently testing those downloads as well. We will be running this to the end of November. I mentioned before that we have some funding for this. That is a finite amount of funding. We want to get it working. We want to share that with everybody, and we want to see what's next. And then we will be closing the pilot, finishing everything on by the end of December this year. So I think it was Gabriella who mentioned sort of awareness and accessibility. Another benefit of the hub is we want to be able to identify where there are low PSR penetration areas. So with companies' data combined, we expect a certain level of PSR customers across all of our different areas. Where that's high or low, we can look at, okay, is there any different type of communication or awareness in the low penetration areas, and what's the best practice that we can take from those really high proportion areas. So I think it's the last slide, please. Thank you. So just to give you a snippet of the information. So this was taken a couple of days ago, and so the numbers will have changed. But this is the extent of the data in the hub as we speak. As you can see, there is a fair amount to go in terms of the company uploads. We do estimate that there will be over 1 million customers supported within this pilot from the information that we are going to be sharing with each other. And the previous sort of tests of this has shown that up to 45% of water customers is unknown to energy companies. So going back to the different conversations that was mentioned between energy and water companies with their customers, there's a real benefit for us all here. And of course, the customers that we're trying to serve correctly. And I think I missed off another one there, but that is where I'll leave it, if that's all right. Next step, sorry, I missed off a slide there. So the next step, sorry, Sunita. So as I mentioned there, we're going to be loading all of the data up. We will be taking our downloads and testing those. The big piece for us is what is the result? What is the benefits that we are seeing from this? How many more customers are we supporting? How many customers are we giving a better service? Because we knew about one situation, we didn't know about the other. And we do have opportunity in January 2024 if ourselves and our partners and the rest of the stakeholders wish to pursue this further, to seek funding for further submission through the Ofwat innovation bids as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Helen. It's such a huge programme, and I remember coming to the sprint back in, what was it, January last year, when this was just a concept, and there's so much work gone into this to make this go live. So it's really exciting to see that data's being put into the hub, and that actually, you know, the examples that you give of just being able to complete that data and being able to pull it and being able to then make sure that you're catching the right people and being able to service them is huge. So thank you so much for taking time out to share that with us. Again, you're going to be on the panel, so we're going to, I'm sure, have some questions for you around how this is working. So thank you, Helen. I'm going to move on, and I'm going to move us along to our last speaker of the day. So I'm going to invite Louise. Hello, Louise, to come on and talk to us about consumer protection in heat networks.
Hi there, thank you very much. Hi everyone, I'm Louise Singleton from GemServe. I'm a principal consultant in our low carbon business unit. And if we go to the next slide. So I'm going to be looking at 4 things in this presentation. The first is just an introduction to heat networks, as I'm not sure how many of you are aware of what they are. And then talking a bit about what is upcoming in legislation and also what exists currently. And then talking a bit about a consumer protection consultation that's currently live from Ofgem and DESNZ. And then finally looking at a sort of more forward look for RECO in this space. So moving on then to what are heat networks. So heat networks are sometimes known just as district heating, but essentially they take heat from a central source and they supply it to either multiple dwellings or multiple buildings along a series of pipes. So there are 2 main types. You have communal heating. So the picture on the left is an example of a communal heating block. And essentially that is supplying heat and hot water to one building. So you can maybe see, it's maybe a bit small, but on the top you've got the energy center or the plant room on the roof of the building, and that's where they're taking the heat from that plant and supplying the heat into all of the different flats in that building. The other type is called district heating, and essentially that's where you take heat and distribute it out to a number of different buildings. So a sort of, I guess, famous example of a district heating network is the Olympic Park in Stratford in London, where it basically all of the different venues for the Olympics and the Athletes Village and all the different areas of buildings on that site were fed from one central energy center. So other examples can be things like hospitals or universities where they have multiple buildings on one site. Heat networks are not new technologies. There are heat networks in the UK that have been here since the 70s, but they are also very big in Europe, particularly in Scandinavia, so in Denmark and Sweden, for example. There's currently around 14,000 heat networks in the UK. I've put serving 500,000 customers, which is what's in the Ofgem consultation, but I've seen Catherine from the Heat Trust is on this webinar and she said around 900,000. So we'll she's just commented on that as well. So some debate on the figures there, but yeah, maybe it's more likely 900,000 now. And essentially from the Committee on Climate Change made a recommendation that for us to meet our net zero targets by 2050, then we need to have around sort of 18 to 20% of heat coming from heat networks by 2050. And apologies for the contrast on that number, but it says up from about 2 to 3% now. So, so there's a bit of a way to go to get us to that 20% figure, but the government is doing a number of things to help us get there. So if we go to the next slide. So this is the government's heat network transformation programme. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview because some of you on this call may be aware of GemServe from our role as the code manager for the REC, but we also do a lot of work in the heat network space. So we've been working on heat network since 2018. The diagram on the left, like I say, is the different projects and programs that the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero has in place to support the growth of heat networks. So the first project, the Heat Network Investment Project, was launched in 2018, and that was designed to help fund the building of new heat networks. That's been since replaced by the Green Heat Network Fund, which essentially is also focusing on building new networks, but is also looking at transitioning the fuel from existing heat networks to help them decarbonize. So helping people move from something like CHP boilers to maybe heat pumps or things like that. So so GemServe has been involved as part of the Triple Point Consortium to deliver both of those schemes. There's then a scheme called the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme. They had a demonstrator back in 2021-22, and the main scheme is currently live, and that's looking at improving the efficiency of existing heat networks. So helping them to improve things like insulation, replace pipes, improve controls, review things around water quality. So yeah, people can apply for capital grants to help improve their networks. And the idea behind that is obviously one from a reducing carbon emissions perspective. Secondly, in terms of helping customers to improve customer detriment, so making sure that customers aren't unduly suffering from things like outages from their heating systems. But also thirdly, looking at regulation is coming down the line within heat networks over the next couple of years. So helping to take our most poorly performing heat networks and help them to raise their current performance to make sure that they're able to meet the upcoming regulations. So the next box down then is NTAS or HNTAS, which is the Heat Network Technical Assurance Scheme. So again, GemServe is working to deliver that with a company called Fairheat, and that's essentially going to be the technical standards that heat networks have to meet from 2025. And GemServe is supporting the governance and assurance arrangements around those standards. So there are currently sort of standards that do exist in the industry, so it's building on those, but these will be regulated sort of legislation that heat networks will have to comply with, and at the moment most of the requirements in the industry are voluntary. So then to sort of frame all of that, there is this sort of market framework, market development piece of work that that DESNZ is doing, and then that's going to be supplemented by heat network zoning, where essentially they're looking to identify areas, predominantly urban areas, where there's waste heat and a high abundance of buildings that could then make use of that heat, and designating zones that if you have a building in that zone, you will be required to connect to a heat network. So again, that piece of work is underway and is looking to come into place in the next couple of years. So if we go to the next slide, I think we might have missed one, maybe. Oh no, sorry. Okay, we'll do it this way. So yeah, so there is a consumer protection consultation that's out currently. Apologies, I think there was actually another slide which was talking around. Oh, maybe that's the next one.
Do you want me to flick on? Would that
yeah,
help?
no, don't worry. I think it's disappeared on the slides, but I was basically talking about what's existing and what's upcoming legislation. So there are, like I say, there is existing well, there is this upcoming legislation that's coming in 2024, and so Ofgem will be appointed as, or have been appointed as part of the Energy Bill as the regulator within heat networks. So that will, so that's going through Parliament at the moment. And from, like I say, from 2025, then there will be legislation and standards that heat networks will have to meet. As Catherine will well know, the Heat Trust exists in heat networks, in the heat networks industry, which is a voluntary scheme that was set up in 2015, and it supports heat networks to demonstrate best practice particularly around consumer protection. So it provides things like access to the Energy Ombudsman, and various other elements that that heat networks can sign up to, but it is on a voluntary basis. So so this legislation is taking that one step further. I believe there was an event held back in July with the Heat Trust with REC as well. So it's something that's they're both very aligned in their thinking in terms of wanting to protect consumers. So so yeah, good to see that Catherine's on the event today as well. So yeah, so I mentioned before there's a consumer protection consultation that's out at the moment. It's a joint consultation from DESNZ and Ofgem. The deadline is next Friday, so it's not too long to go now. RECO will be submitting a response to the consultation. There are 75 questions in total, so it's quite a long one. But one of the key ones, particularly for this session, there is a question around PSR, which is asking if we agree with the proposal to require heat suppliers to operate a PSR. And so it's been really interesting to hear all the discussion today about how there's been work towards consolidation across electricity, gas and water. So I think one of the things that we would want to be including in our response to this consultation is to make sure that there is some degree of sharing of information between heat networks and and electricity, gas, water providers, so that we don't end up in the same situation that we've had previously, where someone might be on a heat network PSR, but then their electricity supplier isn't aware of that. So it's definitely something that we would want to draw out in our response to that consultation. But if anyone has anything else that they would like us to include, particularly around that question, but any others, then please feel free to email me if there is anything you would like to input into the RECO consultation response as well. So if we go to the next slide. GemServe is working with RECO to develop the consultation response, but we're also doing a kind of wider piece of work looking at protection within the heat networks space, and doing a kind of comparison between what exists in electricity and gas now and what exists in heat networks. So we're looking at a number of different areas, including supplier of last resort, grievance resolution, safety standards, PSR, compulsory disconnection, metering and billing, and price regulation, and just trying to work out what the gaps are that exist, and what potentially that the whole idea around introducing legislation and regulation is to give heat network customers the same, if not better, protections that an electricity or gas customer can experience today. So we're kind of looking at what exists in electricity and gas currently, and what would be relevant and applicable to heat network customers. So if we go to the next slide, it's just a very high level kind of, they've all kind of moved out of space, but yeah, so looking at things that do exist or partially exist, I should say, in some cases. So things like PSR, again, through the heat trusts, there is an element of PSR if you're a heat trust member. But again, like I say, it's not a compulsory requirement within the heat network space at the moment. So yeah, so that's just I guess to let you guys know that that's something that RECO is working on and is looking at over the next sort of few weeks or months. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now. I think that's my last slide. So yeah, if anyone has any further questions, I think we're going to go to the Q&A now.
Really sorry if we've done something with your slides. That's meant to, we've really kept you on your toes in this presentation. So thank you for that, and a really interesting piece of work that's developing, and it kind of really lends to the discussion today in terms of it's not just about what we're doing currently, but actually what's coming down the road and what that might mean for the PSR of the future, if you like, and where that sits. So it's a really insightful piece to get some information on and some background on, and we'll be hopefully hearing more about this in the near future as well. But it's a really good place to start in terms of looking at what else is coming down the road, what else do we need to be thinking about. So thank you, that was really useful, and again, apologies for keeping you on your toes there.
That's all right, no
but
worries.
There you go. We're actually about kind of bang on time in terms of where we're going next, and that is kind of to our Q&A. So I'd really like to invite all the speakers onto the screen to turn the cameras on. Marvelous, thank you. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for all your presentations, and it's been so informative. It just shows you the landscape of not only the things that are currently in train, but the things that we need to think about that we could be either doing incrementally, or the things that we need to think about because they are coming. So I want to kind of open the floor in terms of just some early observations from the panel before I turn to some of the questions that have been posted in the Slido. I don't know if anybody wants to make any comments or observations on kind of what they've heard or what we're thinking. And also, if anybody wants to raise their hand and to just talk to us, that's also really a really good plan. So please do raise your hands if you just want to talk to us. No, well, I think one of the things that struck me, and actually I think it was a comment that oh, fire away, Colin.
Oh no, I'm happy to wait on you.
Okay, I was going to say is a comment that Sarah Alderman put in the chat, which was actually the PSR is being asked to do more and more, and it's not always possible for the supplier to meet that consumer needs. And I think that's the kind of the point I was trying to draw out at the beginning, that actually the PSR was designed to do one thing, and now it's morphing into more and more requirements, people asking it to do different things, to be a different function, and not all of the actions that are going to be needed by the consumer are going to be either supplied by the water company or the DNO or the GT or the supplier. And actually it's those other agencies that work with consumers, those vulnerable consumers, and the needs that they have, and it's the actions that they can take to support the consumer, but it's the identification of them that might be key. And some of the work that we're doing and the proposals that we've made and the work that Andy talked about is, how do we identify those people? Could we use the PSR to do that? And it's about looking at this as an evolving change, because the purpose of what it was set up and what people want from it now is very different. So it's really interesting to see that coming out in the comments. Colin.
Thank you. Yeah, possibly a bit controversial, panelists quizzing each other, but I thought I'd jump in. I had a bit of a question for Helen, if that's all right. Obviously, you heard me talking about the kind of longer term ambition towards what we might call a Tailored One system, a national universal register. Do you think the Support for All project is a kind of proof of concept of that? Do you think that could develop into that? Because there's been a bit of debate over whether it should be government delivering it top down, whether it should be industry delivering something more sort of bottom up and more decentralized. Do you think we've talked? I mean, the question I always ask sort of organizations working in this space is, you know, you talked about scaling up. I mean, would the ambition be to scale up all the way and make it become that single solution?
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, really, really interested to hear what you had to say at the beginning as well, because I guess where we started with this was we wanted to get it functioning, working, and then scale it up. But we always knew from the outset of this that this isn't something that a water company or an energy company should own or run or be responsible for. We have had, and when I say me, I say we, me and my head of, my director has had some discussions with government. But if it's all right, I think I'd love to join up the work that you're doing to say, what is it that we can share? You know, what's worked, what have we learned as well? Because the aim was always, you know, let's see how far we can get to widening this up. But I think it feels like now is the right time. Everyone seems to be aligned in understanding what they want, what they need, what the customer needs. It's just, how do we help each other to get there as quick as we possibly can for the customers?
Steve.
Yeah, three quick observations based on the session so far. The first is to remark positively on just, you know, how much energy there is behind this, how many people are working on these problems, and how much collaboration is going on. That's great to see. I mean, it's just nobody's putting up blockers or talking about, you know, not invented here. So that's great to see. The second is just to stress the importance of bringing it back to outcomes, because, you know, as you've rightly said, some of the existing PSR needs codes feel like they're addressing problems that in some cases they almost feel like they go back to the sort of power cuts of the 1970s and doing your homework by candlelight, as opposed
How did
to
you know?
the kind of the more recent challenges. I know a lot of suppliers, for example, energy suppliers, are doing a lot of work around things like autism spectrum challenges and mental health issues and so forth, where there's a lot more complexity and richness than perhaps is currently reflected in PSR needs codes. But as I say, at the moment we're just trying to get the ones that we've got to work. So that's the focus area. But that outcomes thing, I think, is absolutely critical, is that we've got, it's not a numbers game. It's not about who can get the largest PSR. It's about what services are being delivered and what changes are being made to the lives of customers as a result of acting on that information. And that's the critical thing. And I think that's a challenge actually for the regulators and government when, you know, when thinking about how it's measured, how the effectiveness of it is measured, and also self-reporting for the industries, right? And then the third is something that Helen and I were talking about earlier this week, actually, which is that it's really important not to get so much data that you can't see the wood for the trees. And so we know that the DNOs, for example, have priority needs codes, which are the ones related to keeping customers safe in the event of a power outage, and non-priority needs codes. For energy suppliers, that'll probably look different. For water companies, again, so we were talking about, you know, the prioritization of the needs codes as far as water companies is concerned, and a lot of good work has been done on that. So when we talk, you know, as we have today, about expanding data sources and you know, potentially moving in the future to some form of universal PSR, I think it's really, really critical to ensure that we understand the problem statements that we're trying to address, and how the individual organisations are going to be able to work with that data and not just get buried in so much that that they can't process it and lose sight of the customer at the heart of this.
That's a really important point, and actually that neatly segues into some of the questions. And Gabby, there are quite a few of them are for you and probably / me, in terms of the questions around the PSR flag and the data sharing. And I think to your point, Steve, actually, we're not saying that we should change the needs codes. It's about visibility. It's that point about who can actually help the consumer, and that's where the PSR is being asked to move to. Like, open this up so that the right people can help the consumer. So opening it up so that there's visibility doesn't necessarily mean at this stage a change of needs codes. What it means is making sure the right people are seeing it so that the consumer could possibly be serviced in a way that they aren't currently being. And Andy's paper kind of using the NHS example of medical equipment support. It's not just the supplier who needs to be involved in that, it's actually the NHS trust that needs to be involved in that. So opening it up so that they could see it. So there's a couple of questions on that, and I don't know how this is going to play out. So Teresa, are you going to call out the questions, or do you want me to just
Yeah, no, that's fine. I can go through. Obviously, we're still getting some questions coming in at the time, so it maybe I'm just trying to put them in a chronological order, really. Yeah, we've obviously got a fair few come in. I think one that's already been covered already, but maybe just for a clarification again, is what was the PSR originally designed to do? Was one of the questions.
I'm going to put Colin in the frame, but I might just say, I think the answer is, and actually maybe Steve is maybe best placed to answer this, but I think it was originally designed to look at those incidents which are kind of when the grid goes down, or the, you know, that DNO has to step in and make sure that people who need electricity are identified and therefore receiving some form of help to get them back on as quickly as possible. So it was that kind of event driven. If there's a real big problem, how do you make sure that those people who are vulnerable and in need are helped by you as in the energy sector or in the water sector? And it was kind of really prescribed in that way, that it was very focused on what you do in that event. Have I got that wrong? Colin was nodding. I'm assuming that is correct.
Yeah, I was just going to say, my understanding chimes with that, and it's a really interesting point to reflect on, because one of the challenges or risks that we're looking at in terms of the Universal Priority Services Register that we might be building towards is that you need to balance between you know, widening and deepening. So how many different organizations or sectors are you going to involve in this, and deepening how deep, how many different kind of outcomes or services or needs are you going to cater for. And one of the risks we identified when we were kind of looking at this is that if you create something like that, are you creating an expectation of service delivery that isn't, you know, perhaps realistic, especially in the first iterations of it, because it has to be built sort of slowly and carefully. So yeah, it's definitely a really important point to think about. And I think those in energy, those interruption disconnection situations are still forefront of our minds, and in terms of reducing harm, in the absolute worst situations, there's risk to life. if you don't identify the right people in those kind of extreme weather incidents and other things like that. So yeah, really important point to reflect on.
And that may remain the primary focus of PSRs, certainly for the duration. That may never change, but there are things on the periphery that mean other actors, other agencies, other bodies could be helping consumers, and that's the move. That's the change, I think, that's coming from where it was all the while. There's another cluster of questions, isn't there, around the flag?
There
Sorry.
is. I mean, one's come in. Who do you expect to use the PSR flag and or the PSR flag with the minimum data option?
Gabby, do you want me to take that?
Yeah, sure.
I think that our thinking is that thing about opening it up so there's more visibility. It's not to distract from the fact that there's already information flows between DNO and water, or between DNOs and suppliers. It's to give visibility to those others, the other actors, the other people who could be helping. And if there's a change of supplier, for example, that flag could help that process, recognizing that people don't necessarily transfer that data. And Steve's already pointed out that actually switching is a big problem. That data is lost. The flag could be an indicator that helps the new supplier, the gaining supplier, recognize there is something there. They need to pick that up, and it can help that process. So it isn't to replace that process; it's to assist that process. And I think we see this as being on, for example, the inquiry services, and it allows people to see it, and being able to open it to other agencies so that they can see it and they can have access to that information, and they can be part of the package that supports that consumer. Did I miss anything, Gabby? And I can see that Steve Donovan also raised his hand on that. Steve.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to come in on that one, if that's cool, just to get a little bit of clarity. Oh, where's my camera? There I am. I'm hiding away home today. So I'm just trying to get this in my head, and I always struggle with this. And I know we've had conversations about this in the past as well. So like the example you've given there of like supplier to supplier data sharing, how useful is just a vulnerability flag? So like, Colin, I'd welcome your view on things like how would suppliers then interpret things like code of practice guidance, which is very granular. How, do we then differentiate on those things? So my understanding has always been quite clear. The expectations on the onboarding supplier, we've got to make sure that we do that for our onboarding processes and take the appropriate steps and make a proactive attempt to understand people's circumstances. And everything that we seem to be talking about today talks about do what we've done in the past with PSR, focus on the what is it we're going to do for people, not these characteristics, so that we can promote this engagement. And then the broad flag thing just seems to come in from left field, and I struggle to understand what we're trying, which bit of the problem are we trying to fix by introducing this broader flag? I still don't get it. I'm sorry if that sounds quite negative, but I'm just trying to understand it better.
No, that's good. I think it's, and I see Kate has also joined. The flag is to open up that visibility. So again, this comes back to that the changing landscape of what people are expecting from the PSR and how we could be helping consumers. And not all the answers sit with either the supplier, the DNO, or the GT. They sit in different places. The help that the consumer needs. So what this is doing is to opening up that view, and a flag only. You're right. It doesn't give everybody the whole answer, but it does allow some continuity. It does help the consumer not fall through the gaps. For example, if we use the switching as an example, it does help that process and avoid gaps occurring. But it also means from the consumer lens, if you look at it from the consumer lens, what we're saying is the consumer shouldn't be the one that has to get back on the phone to the different supplier, to the water company or the DNO or whoever, and say, hello, I know I told the last person, now I've got to tell you, or to find the form to fill in. And the entry way to get on that system is so different. It's different for a water company. It's different from supplier to supplier. It's certainly different from DNOs. And, if I asked my mum to get on the PSR, she wouldn't know how to do that, but she'd have to go and find out how to do it. And it's looking at it from the consumer lens. How does this help the consumer? You may already be doing this, and that's great, but actually there are gaps. It's is a complicated system for consumers to navigate, and that is a barrier to getting them on the PSR in the first place. So if you put the consumer lens on this, what helps the consumer make sure that they are getting the services they need, get on the register? And a flag is a first stepping stone to saying, actually, there is a need here. How are we making sure that we're capturing that, we're keeping it live, we're making sure that the right people are seeing it? And the flag, you're right, it will have limited implications because it's only a flag, but it tells you something. It tells you there is something here that needs to be followed up. So I think that's the lens that we're looking at it. We're looking at it from that consumer lens. What is it that helps the consumer get what they need? And it's not to undermine something that's already there, it's to bring that broader visibility and to make sure that they aren't falling through the gaps. Using a flag plus, using those minimum data sets, means that you do get more data. It means that mean that you start on the front foot in terms of understanding the consumer need with that consumer lens. So it's not about replacing what's there, it's about making sure that that visibility is there so that the consumer need isn't lost. Does that help?
I'm gonna reflect on it, I think.
Good, and I'm gonna move to Katie. I'm running. I've realised we're 2 minutes from the end, so and I'm so excited that we've got these conversations going. But Katie,
it's a very quick point, and I think I kind of agree with everything Stephen said there. That I'm just confused at the benefits. I appreciate what you're saying about looking at it from the consumer lens, but this certainly doesn't tick the box of the tell us once approach.
no,
Because if anyone sees that flag, all they're going to then have to do is phone that customer up. And if that flag is sent out to multiple parties, they're going to start getting phone calls from potentially multiple people. So it's just like working out what the benefits are and if they actually align with the kind of strategic objectives that Colin set out at the beginning, because I certainly don't think it ticks that box, but I might be misunderstanding.
I think it's not the end point, it's a stepping stone. It's those incremental changes that begin to move the dial. It's certainly not the end point, Katie. I don't think that adding a flag is suddenly the tell me once principle, the holy grail that we're all moving to. That's not going to be it. But it is that stepping stone. How do we start to open up the data so it's more visible, has the consumer lens on it, and starts to move that dial? It's not the end point. It's certainly the beginning. It's the beginning of that. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that, or whether we want to move on to any of the other questions, Teresa.
Yeah, there's quite a few around data. Yeah, to be honest, and obviously very conscious of time. I mean, obviously we've got one of the questions, would RECO be looking to add the UPRN into the EES, the electricity inquiry services, to facilitate linking of the data?
That is our early thought. That is what we're thinking. I think that seems a sensible landing place. But again, would be welcome people's views and thoughts on that. But that is our early thinking indeed. So is there
there's another one about
one
data.
more, because we're bang on 4 o'clock and
Yep.
I'm really mindful of time.
Yep,
and people are having to leave us.
So there's one that's coming. So we assume those eligible for a PSR will be happy with their data being shared across a wider network of agencies. What control or opt-out would the consumer have? What are the thoughts around that on part of the design?
I think this comes back to Steve's point about sharing, on changing the basis for sharing from moving from consent to SPI, and that would be certainly a consideration that we'd have to give to that. And again, sharing the data on a basis that is limited to what you share, taking the outcomes based approach on that. Helen.
Just I can give some sort of like real life examples on that if you like, in terms of, you know, the energy and water sharing that we're doing right now. So at Northumbrian Water, we have had a tiny handful, and must admit, like less than 5 customers wishing to opt out. Part of the onboarding process is we communicate to each and every one of our customers that we accept the data from somewhere else to invite them and welcome them onto our PSR. We explain the benefits in that communication. For those handful of customers who have chosen to opt out, the team have actually had a follow-up conversation, and to date there is not a single customer, once we've had the discussion with them and they've understood why, has actually come off. So the option is there, but I think it's building that awareness and the benefit for the customer, and once the understanding is there, hopefully that is a route that continues.
Thank you, Helen. And we are now 2 minutes over, so I'm really mindful and people are having to drop off the call to go onto other calls, but that's been really useful, and I'm hoping this is the start of a conversation and the start of looking at what's out there and how we might join up the dots and look at bringing this collaboration piece together again. So I'd like to thank again all of you for attending and for all of your questions and raising awareness of what's going on, and to all our speakers for giving up their time to partake in this. It's been really, really useful. So thank you all for joining, and thank you again to our speakers.